Structuring of the war in the West. And if we remember General Grant in central Mississippi, he had been successful in Vicksburg. So he's got some men to spare. And he's ordered by Washington to send a corps, Sherman's corps, to Chattanooga, to Thomas's aid, to help get control of the situation and drive the Confederates back and save the federal post there from starvation and complete destruction and ruin. This is the path that Sherman takes as he's ordered to Chattanooga. From Vicksburg, he leaves Vicksburg on the 26th. Now, I'll say this is staggered. He takes like 3 divisions with him, and they all leave at different points in time. These dates should correspond to when Sherman is where, but they'll be a little earlier or later, depending on who you're with. So Sherman proceeds by steamboat down the Mississippi. The water is so low in the Mississippi at this time that his transport boats are constantly getting stuck on sandbars and having to dig themselves out. It's very low water, and that's actually the reason why he doesn't go by river all the way to the shoals, is that the water is too low in the Tennessee River and the Cumberland River to get his transport boats up that far. So he takes an agonizingly slow trip from Vicksburg on the 26th, arriving in Memphis on October 3rd. Now, in the meantime, personal tragedy strikes for General Sherman. He had his family with him, his wife Minnie and his children, while they were in and around Vicksburg. And his family are traveling back with him north. And his son, Willie, his pride and joy, gets typhoid fever and dies in Memphis pretty much as soon as they arrive at the gate of the hotel. And Sherman begins moving his forces east by way of the Memphis and Charleston Railroad in the direction of Corinth. Why did I hear my clothes? Did anyone see what I did in my clothes? That's not good. Well, Sherman continues moving east. He is not a big fan of the railroad. He considers it folly to try and hold on to the railroad as a line of supply. He much favors the waterways, the Tennessee River in particular. And the reason, of course, is that as soon as his army moves through a place and fixes the railroad, the second that they're gone, local Confederates come and break it at their back. So it's constantly being broken. He says, however, that the Tennessee River is more reliable, even for all the fluctuations in water. Writing on the 26th of October, after he had already arrived at Corinth, Sherman said, "We are much obliged to the Tennessee, which has favored us most opportunely, for I am never easy with a railroad which takes a whole army to guard, each foot of rail being essential to the whole, whereas they cannot stop the Tennessee. Each boat can make its own game." Later on, he said, "For my part, I wish all the railroads were taken up and Corinth left to its native nothingness. It is a nuisance. The Mississippi and Tennessee rivers must be held securely forever, and all else be secondary." So this is important too, because Sherman is learning a very important lesson about supplying a large army. That it is folly to rely on railroad to feed all the men and animals, and that you must, in fact, subsidize your army off of the populations living around wherever it may happen to launch. And this is a philosophy that he will put into effect devastatingly whenever he reaches Georgia later in the year 1864. In advance of Sherman's column, this general and his division, Peter Joseph Osterhaus, the Prussian-born general, presses forward into what is now Colbert County ahead of Sherman's main column. The reason for this is that they originally thought that they would cross at Florence, but the water is too low in the Tennessee River, so they eventually cross at Eastport. But as Osterhaus is pushing forward with that column, he comes upon the house of a man named Jacob Albright, who lived in and around Barton. And Mr. Albright's SDC petition is really interesting about details of just how economically the army at this time utilized the private property of local citizens. Jacob Albright said, "General Sherman's command came into the country and commenced tearing down my fence. They shot my oxen and carried them off. They uncovered my cotton, which was covered with straw, and carried the cotton off. They burned the tanner's tools and bellows of the blacksmith shop. The command encamped on my place and all around my house. General Osterhaus had his headquarters in my house. There was some 30 or 40,000 soldiers, and they were generally engaged. The first days, the officers would not let them take a thing, but the second day, the officers told me that the men were obliged to forage and that they could not help the taking of my property. The general remained overnight. I heard no orders for the soldiers to take the property. I complained to the officers and they said they could not help it. The day was cold and wet. They stripped away my barn of all the boards and planks to make bunks, and they used the cotton for bedding. I complained to General Osterhaus and other officers in reference to my property. The general told me that I would have to let them take their course, that the weather was unpleasant, and that they had to have beds to lie on and provisions to feed. So this really clarifies the Federal Army's perspective regarding private property, that it's all really just free game in this larger movement that's taking place. Remember how we got here. From the disaster at Chickamauga and the Federals being almost starved out of Chattanooga, to Grant having been despair after Vicksburg and sending Sherman east to take over and help the situation. That movement has resulted in Mr. Osterhaus having his barn taken apart. It is so interesting to observe how these large macro movements play out in the lives of everyday people. To put it according to Sherman, his property was bound to help either the Federal Army or the rebels, and they could at least destroy it if they couldn't take it to prevent the rebels from getting it. Now, Sherman does cross the Tennessee River at Eastport. He marches down through Lauderdale County and does encamp for a while at Florence. Sally Foster, the diarist at Portview, she notes that Sherman and his command are at the male college, which today we call Wesleyan University. They camped all in and around the Wesleyan University. On Thursday, the enemy came marching up in large force, both cavalry and infantry. A great many officers stayed here, in our house. When they first came in, the stragglers knocked down all the beehives and killed most of the chickens. So we had to catch the few they left and put them in the pantry. They camped on the male college hill and in the college, and a great many places. An army passed through today and a great many yesterday. They have beautiful music. I was awakened this morning by them leaving, and also the beautiful music. They stayed in my room and the boys' room, so we had to come over to our brother Watt's room. Sherman, by the time he gets to Elk River, actually says, I find plenty of corn, cattle, hogs, etc. on this route, but I don't think there will be much left after my army passes. I never saw such greedy rascals after chickens and fresh meat. I don't know, it would be a good plan to march my army back and forth from Florence and Stevenson to make a belt of devastation between the enemy and our country. So really, this has a multiple-pronged effect, just like as we saw with corn and spray. It's not just about materially supplying the army's wants, making sure the men are fed and clothed and that the horses have hay. This is really about crippling the Confederacy from within and its ability to subsidize this war with material and with morale. And Sherman understands that better than anyone, arguably, and he's really putting this into practice at the Tennessee Valley in October and November 1863. Now, as Sherman moves through the Tennessee Valley en route to Chattanooga, he orders General Dodge to move his corps. I think it's the 16th Main Army Corps, don't quote me. Anyway, Dodge's men are ordered to follow along Sherman's rear and join Sherman's column. And General Dodge therefore leaves the city of Corinth, which had been his stronghold for a year now, and he makes his way through Lauderdale County. And actually, my research with the Southern Plains Commission, and in addition to Dodge's private papers, I can track very, very closely, and really with a remarkable degree of precision for 19th century documents, where exactly his command was and when. So they crossed at Eastport on November 6th, which was the head of navigation on the Tennessee River for most of the year, crossing over to Waterloo. Number one there, they came to the home of a man named Alexander Russell, who was 66 years old in 1863. He lived alone, 15 miles northwest of Florence. He had 3 grown sons, all of whom were serving in the military, some for the Confederacy, some for the Union. He testified in his SCC petition that Colonel Phillips of Dodge's command took from him 50 bushels of potatoes. he reckoned they were worth $50. Now, if that's all the property that they took from Mr. Russell, it's probably because that's really all he had that was worth taking. 50 bushels of potatoes. But he lived 15 miles northwest of Florence, just west of Gravelly Springs. Dodge is at Gravelly Springs on November 7th. Point number 2, the home of Jared Gresham. Jared Gresham had a farm on Bertram's Creek, 12 miles northwest of Florence. Mr. Gresham and his son testified that Dodge's men raided their house and carried away 2 overcoats worth $8 each. Mr. Gresham's grandson recalled that they also took a silver watch, 2 silver cups, and $20 in cash. But he may as well have omitted these details because, as I pointed out, the Southern Claims Commission never paid for acts of plunder. So if they stole your silver or your money, then that's not a military necessity. You don't get paid for that. But that's on Bertram's Creek here, number 2. Number 3, the Ford of Bob Kennedy and Company, the community of Happy Hollow today. There was a massive factory in the 1860s there called Bob Kennedy and Company. It's really a local landmark. But as they pass through on the way to Bob Kennedy and Company, which I have as number 4, they come to John Wilson's plantation, where an enslaved man named Henry Dunn was living. Henry Dunn has a remarkable story. He was hired out by his master to work as a blacksmith for Bob Kennedy and Company. And whenever it was after working hours, he was allowed to use some of the tools to work for himself and keep whatever money he was able to make, which was a very generous arrangement because his labor belonged to his enslaver. And so if he worked for Bob Kennedy and Company, then his enslaver got paid by Bob Kennedy and Company. But Dodge's man takes from him a horse and buggy at this time on the road to Bob's factory. Number 4. Jacob Stutz, living Alabama Highway 64 on the way to Lexington. I don't know how familiar you are in that area. That's where I'm from, so I'm very familiar with that area. Close to the Atlas Church of Christ, that sort of area. That's where Jacob Stutz was residing. He claimed the following property taken by Dodge's men while they encamped on his farm: 200 bushels of corn, 2,800 bundles of fodder, 4,000 fence rails, 16 geese, 27 gallons of brandy, 3 horses, 14 gallons of molasses, and 2,000 pounds of pork, amounting to just over $1,500 in 1874 dollars, which by one metric I found is worth close to $40,000 today in property from a one-night stay from Dodge's command on his property. They also used his home as headquarters. Mr. Stutz spoke about himself as being a Union man, and Colonel Payne, one of Dodge's officers, said that he was sorry for it, that they couldn't help it, because if they didn't take the property, then the rebels would, which by now should be a familiar refrain for us. By November 9th, Dodge had reached Lexington, and on the 11th of November, Dodge's command reached Pulaski, which will be their center of operations for the next several months. This is going to be a very brief summary of what happens at Chattanooga at the end of the year 1863. So, General Grant is promoted to head of all of the armies in the West, because he is certainly a man who has proven to Lincoln that he can get things done. So he is promoted over all federal troops in the West. Sherman takes Grant's place as head of the Army of the Tennessee. And Sherman and Grant and their forces set about securing the federal foothold at Chattanooga. And to do this, they drive the Confederates out of their mountain perches overlooking the city in a very swift campaign, which takes place at the end of November 1863. And they push Bragg and the Confederates essentially back to Dalton, Georgia, which is a very comfortable distance away down the railroad. And Bragg, for his part, will be fired for this and replaced by Joe Johnston. But this really solidifies the federal foothold at Chattanooga, which is going to be very momentous for us as we go into the year 1864, having a railroad depot on the Tennessee River so strategically poised for the railroad leading into the southern heartland of Georgia. Now, as that all takes place, there's another shift here in the balance of power. And so this map really shows you the disposition of forces at the time, early in the year 64. So again, we have General Dodge in and around Pulaski. He has his very capable subordinate colonels, Colonel Phillips and Colonel Spencer. Colonel Spencer, Eliphas Spencer, is colonel of the 1st Alabama, which many of you have talked to me about. It's a loyal Unionist regiment that is attached to Dodge's forces at this time. And Dodge really has an extensive network of spies and informants that extend deep into Confederate territory south of the river. And again, at Chattanooga, we see General Thomas, who's left in control of the situation, because Grant, in March 1864, is going to be promoted to Lieutenant General of all United States armies, a post previously held by George Washington. And he is recalled to Virginia to work some of his magic over there because Lincoln had not found a general who could actually take control of the situation in Virginia. Grant will prove to be the man. Now, Grant and Sherman are good friends. They see things eye to eye. And in the spring of 1864 at Nashville, they come together in a very fateful meeting, and they make a plan for how they are going to subdue the Confederacy starting in the spring of '64. And so Sherman is left commander of all federal forces in the West, while Grant goes east to Virginia. Now, opposing all of them, Joe Johnston, the Army of Tennessee at Dalton, and a host of Confederate cavalry. All of these men here, Forrest, Roddy, and Patterson, are cavalry commanders. Cavalry is so important in this era because they move quickly, nimbly, whereas infantry lumber over the countryside. They're easy to spot, they're easy to pick off, but cavalry are not. They can respond quickly to situations, and they can provide reconnaissance from far-flung places. And these men, Forrest especially, but also Roddy, are constantly being shifted between theaters of battle. And you'll see Confederate commanders arguing with one another. It's like, I must have Roddy. No, I need Roddy. It's like, please send me Forrest. And it's like, Forrest is currently engaged in my command. So there's not enough cavalry to go around. But they're all operating roughly south of the Tennessee River. Now, the Tennessee River at this time becomes really the de facto boundary between Union-held Middle Tennessee and Confederate-held Alabama. The Tennessee River is the boundary that the federal army is prepared to defend. I will say, though, it is a boundary, but I like to call it more a net than a wall. It has gaps. It allows people to come in and cross back and forth, especially at the shoals. And this sets the stage for what I'm calling notable skirmishes in the spring of 1864. Now, at this time, the Tennessee River is crisscrossed by these Confederate cavalry groups and also infantry groups who are basically doing what the Federals did last spring. They're just trying to get as much forage for themselves as they can and make life difficult for the Federal command in Middle Tennessee. Personally, Dodge, his role in all of this, in the grand scheme, is to oversee the repair of the railroad that runs from Nashville to Decatur and use it as a supply line to stockpile material at Chattanooga ahead of the spring campaign. So this one single railroad from Murfreesboro and Tullahoma they had already determined was not sufficient. So Dodge, the railroad builder, is going to oversee the construction of the railroad from Nashville to Decatur as a line of supply. And in order to do this, and to guard the railroad that he does repair, he relies on so-called U.S. colored infantry. These are men who are in like the 110th, 111th U.S. colored infantry, men who escaped bondage in the Tennessee Valley, went behind federal lines, were mustered into regiments, wore uniforms, and these men, their charge, their mission is to guard the railroad that Dodge completes against Confederate raids ahead of the spring campaign into Georgia. That's the context for the larger image of the war in the West at this time. So, on the micro level, as we saw, this plays out in a number of skirmishes throughout the spring of 1864. Already, January 25th, 1864, there's a skirmish on Huntsville Road and at the Sweetwater Mansion. This is ahead of a two-pronged Confederate attack that sees General Roddy attack Athens on January 26th. On January 29th, Colonel Phillips is sent by Dodge to, quote, clean out Culbert's Reserve. The Confederates had gotten too comfortable on the north bank of the Tennessee River. In fact, one piece of intel that Dodge received at this time is a Confederate Major Falconet was actually going to be married in Florence. in January 1864. So, they're comfortable enough to be having social events on the north bank of the Tennessee River. So Phillips is sent to clean up Culver's reserve. But again, this is an opportunity for some people. Lewis Beckwith is a man who is enslaved at Peter's plantation in January 1864. And when Phillips comes to Culver's reserve, he follows the army back to Pulaski and helps the Federal war effort. There's also a handful of others, and just because it is not on this map, it doesn't mean it didn't happen. I just picked sort of big ones. And then we have March 21st, Colonel Phillips really gets it handed to him at Moulton. He's lucky to escape with his life. This is deep in Confederate territory, by the way. Florence, there's a skirmish here on the 31st of March. Skirmish at the Peters Plantation on April 12th. This is a moment that actually is mythologized in the local lore of the war here in the Tennessee Valley. Bill McDonald referred to this event in his work as the capture of the White Horse Soldiers. These men who are encamped at Peters Plantation are surprised by a Confederate expedition under command of, is it Samuel Ives? I believe Samuel Ives. Colonel Ives and Colonel Jackson, James Jackson Jr. They surprised detachment of the 9th Ohio Cavalry and take prisoners and send them down south in prison. And this is a scandalous moment. But White Horse Soldiers, I've never seen anything in contemporary documents using that term. I think it's something that has only entered popular consciousness later on. And then Colonel Rowlett of the 7th Illinois has a skirmish at Florence and Sweetwater on May 7th. He's compelled to retreat from the town, but then a week later he reoccupies it. So this is reminiscent of that oft-touted statistic that I hear all the time, that the city of Florence changed hands 44 times during the war. And I question how you can possibly quantify that, because I contend that not every single skirmish that took place in Lauderdale County makes it into the official records. Not every single skirmish makes it into a diary. There are, in other words, innumerable small instances where the city may have, quote, changed hands. How do we quantify that? How do we define that? I think that that's part of the problem. But you can see that there's this constant back and forth and tag, irrit, this, and all in the context of not attempting to hold on to the city of Florence, but just to use it for purposes for a time. Eliza Weekly, in her diary, the action on the 25th at Huntsville Road, for that day, she said, Johnston and the Yankees had a fight at Raccoon Branch, 4.5 miles from town. Captain Ingram was killed, his brother-in-law mortally wounded. Some were left at Hawkins' place, some at Price's, and some at Judge Posey's. Bob was taken to Mr. N. Wilson's. This is sort of an innocuous reference here, but the reason I included it is you see how, as these relatively small skirmishes are taking place, local people are being impacted in visceral ways. This Weekly is on a first-name basis with some of the people who are killed and wounded at this skirmish on Huntsville Road. And she also mentions that the wounded are taken to the houses of local people to be cared for. And as you know, I'm at Pope's Tavern right now, and it's obviously spoken about Pope's Tavern that it served as a hospital. But I also contend that virtually any house of any significance would have served, at least at some points, as a makeshift hospital, as events like this would have taken place. I wish I could maybe just a little more, but I won't. Okay, I'll pick up next time with the spring of 1864.